Everything was going wrong for the Americans in the summer of 1942. The Japanese had swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave, conquering islands and territories with terrifying speed. Allied forces were on the defensive, struggling to halt the enemy's advance before it reached Australia. The Solomon Islands had become the new front line, and on Guadalcanal, the first major Allied offensive was underway. But supplies were short, the jungle was brutal, and Japanese reinforcements were pouring in. Henderson Field, the vital airstrip captured by the Marines, was under constant threat. If it fell, the entire campaign could collapse. But on a coral ridge just south of the airfield, something extraordinary was about to happen. Around 840 exhausted U.S. Marines from the 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion would face down over 3,000 battle-hardened Japanese troops from the 35th Infantry Brigade. Outnumbered more than 3-1, with limited ammunition and no heavy armor, these men would hold their ground through 2 nights of savage fighting. Their stand would shatter the Japanese offensive, save Henderson Field, and turn the tide of the Guadalcanal campaign. This is the story of one of the most incredible defensive battles in Marine Corps history, a forgotten ridge that became a graveyard for Japanese ambitions. Let's take a look at how a handful of raiders and paramarines survived the impossible against relentless Banzai charges. The Lunga Perimeter, September 11th, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson surveyed the steamy jungle ridges south of Henderson Field and felt a grim sense of foreboding. The Guadalcanal campaign was just over a month old. U.S. Marines had landed on August 7th, seizing the unfinished Japanese airfield and establishing a precarious perimeter around Lunga Point. The fighting had been fierce from the start. Naval battles raged offshore, Japanese bombers struck daily, and the tropical diseases were as deadly as the enemy. Edson commanded the 1st Raider Battalion, elite shock troops trained for amphibious raids and close combat. His men, nicknamed Edson's Raiders, had been in the thick of it since the landings on Tulagi. Now reinforced by the battered 1st Parachute Battalion, down to just 214 men after earlier fights, Edson's combined force totaled about 840. They were armed with M1 Grand Rifles, BARs, 30 caliber machine guns, and a few mortars. Artillery support was available from 105 millimeter howitzers of the 11th Marines. But in the dense jungle, it would have to be called in precisely. The ridge they occupied, later called Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge, was a 1,000-yard-long coral spine running north-south, with Hill 123 as its dominant knob in the center. It overlooked Henderson Field to the north, making it a perfect defensive position. But intelligence suggested trouble. Native scouts in a recent raid on the Japanese base at Tasimboko had uncovered plans for a major assault. Documents captured there revealed thousands of Japanese troops converging on the perimeter. Edson was a tough, no-nonsense officer, 45 years old with a reputation for iron discipline. He positioned his men carefully. Raiders on the west flank, paramarines on the east, with machine guns sighted for interlocking fire. Foxholes were dug hastily in the hard coral. The Marines were low on supplies, many had only a few grenades and limited ammo belts. The jungle heat was oppressive, malaria was rampant, and morale was strained after weeks of combat. But Edson was cautious. On September 8th, his raiders had raided Tasimboko, destroying Japanese supplies and confirming the enemy buildup. He reported up to Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, who agreed to let Edson's unit rest on the ridge, really a euphemism for preparing defenses. The Japanese opposite them were elite troops from Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's brigade, veterans of campaigns in China and the Philippines. They were thought to be planning a multi-pronged attack to recapture the airfield. Edson had no idea that just a few miles away, hidden in the tangled jungle, over 6,000 Japanese troops were massing for an all-out offensive. Kawaguchi had split his forces into 3 columns, his main center force of 3,000 men, pushing from the south, Colonel Akinosuke Oka's 1,000 from the west, and the Kuma Battalion from the east. Their goal, overwhelm the Marines in a night assault, and seize Henderson Field by dawn. It was a bold plan, but the jungle would prove as much an enemy as the Americans. The storm breaks. At dusk on September 12, 1942, the Guadalcanal night came alive with danger. Japanese warships, a cruiser and 3 destroyers, slipped offshore and unleashed a 20-minute barrage on the ridge. Shells whistled overhead, exploding in the treetops and sending shrapnel raining down. The Marines hunkered in their foxholes, taking minimal casualties but rattled by the noise. A Japanese float plane dropped flares, bathing the ridge in eerie light. Edson and his men waited. Patrols had clashed with Japanese probes earlier in the day, but now the real attack was coming. Kawaguchi's center force, delayed by the impenetrable jungle and faulty maps, finally reached their jump-off points after dark. At around 9:30 p.m., the first waves hit. Major Yukichi Kokusho's 1st Battalion slammed into the Raiders Company C on the right flank, between the Lunga River and the lagoon. The Japanese came screaming out of the darkness. Banzai! Banzai! Charging with fixed bayonets in a human wave. It was the infamous Banzai tactic, massed infantry rushes, designed to overwhelm defenders through sheer ferocity and numbers. The Marines opened up with everything they had. Machine guns chattered, rifles cracked, and mortars thumped. The lead Japanese fell in heaps, but more poured forward, exploiting a gap and overrunning a platoon. Edson called in artillery from the 105mm howitzers, walking the shells right onto the attackers. The explosions lit the night, shredding the Japanese ranks. Kokusho's men tangled with another Japanese unit in the confusion, halting their momentum. By dawn, the attack petered out. 12 Marines were dead, but the ridge held. Japanese bodies littered the slopes. Estimates of their losses that night were in the hundreds. As the sun rose on September 13th, Cactus Air Force planes from Henderson Field strafed the jungle south of the ridge, adding to the carnage. Edson knew this was just the beginning. He pulled his lines back 400 yards to a tighter perimeter around Hill 123, creating an open killing field. He addressed his men. They were testing, just testing. They'll be back. Hold this line or we die. His words steeled the exhausted Marines. The first wave. By early evening on September 13th, the Japanese were ready again. Another brief naval bombardment softened the ridge, then Kawaguchi unleashed his main assault. Major Masao Tamura's 2nd Battalion hit the left flank at Hill 80 around 10 p.m. 2 companies, 320 men, charging uphill with bayonets gleaming under flares. The Paramarines met them with a wall of fire. Machine guns swept the slopes, cutting down the front ranks. But the Japanese pressed on, fanatical in their determination. They reached the crest, pushing back Paramarine Company B and forcing a retreat. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted, bayonets clashing, knives flashing, men grappling in the mud. Meanwhile, Kokusho's battalion renewed its attack on the right, overrunning positions and infiltrating a gap. Some Marines mistook Japanese grenades for gas and panicked briefly, but officers like Major Kenneth D. Bailey rallied them with shouts and pistol fire. The fighting devolved into chaos. Point-blank shootouts, grenade duels, and brutal melees. Edson directed from just 20 yards behind the line, calmly adjusting artillery that rained down 1,992 shells that night. The Japanese paused at one point to devour captured Marine rations, giving the defenders a brief respite. But then came the Banzai charges in earnest, waves of screaming soldiers hurling themselves at the foxholes. 3 Japanese companies briefly reached the edge of the airfield's Fighter 1 runway, but Marine engineers and reserves drove them back. By 4 a.m., after hours of savage combat, the attack slackened. The Marines had held, but at a cost. Positions were shattered. Ammo was critically low. The Banzai onslaught. As the second night wore on, Kawaguchi committed more troops. Lieutenant Colonel Kusukichi Watanabe's 3rd Battalion joined the fray, but jungle confusion limited their impact. On the flanks, Oka's and the Kuma Battalion's attacks were delayed or misdirected. Oka's men hit the western perimeter around 4 a.m., capturing a small ridge but pinned down by artillery. The Kuma Battalion assaulted the southeastern lines around midnight, engaging in hand-to-hand with the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, but were repulsed. The core of the battle was on Hill 123. Japanese Banzai charges came in relentless waves, hundreds of men at a time yelling battle cries, ignoring losses as they closed to grenade range. Marines threw their last grenades, then picked up Japanese ones and hurled them back. Bayonet counterattacks by Paramarine Companies B and C reclaimed lost ground on the east flank. Reserves from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines plugged gaps, fighting with whatever they had: rifles, pistols, even entrenching tools. Edson orchestrated it all, his voice steady on the radio amid the din. Artillery fire was so close it endangered his own men, but it decimated the attackers. By dawn on September 14th, the Japanese assaults had failed. Pockets of enemy snipers remained, but 3 U.S. Army P-400 fighters strafed the slopes, killing scores more. Kawaguchi's survivors withdrew into the jungle, leaving behind heaps of dead. The siege. Through the night of September 14th to 15th, sporadic attacks continued. The Kuma Battalion probed again, weakly, and Oka's remnants were driven off. 6 Marine light tanks swept the area without infantry support, destroying Japanese guns but losing 3 to anti-tank fire. By midday, the battle was over. Edson's men, bloodied and depleted, had held the ridge. The Marines' situation had been desperate. Low on ammo, with shallow foxholes and no sleep for days. Malaria and dysentery weakened many, but their discipline held. They trusted Edson, who led from the front, and their training in close combat proved decisive. The artillery, over 2,800 rounds total, was the great equalizer, turning the open approaches into death traps. Kawaguchi was stunned. His brigade, meant to sweep the Marines into the sea, was shattered. He had underestimated the defenders' numbers and resolve, assuming the ridge was lightly held. The jungle had delayed his coordination, turning a planned pincer into piecemeal assaults. Now, his men retreated, many dying of wounds or starvation during the evacuation. The breaking point. Dawn on September 14th revealed the carnage. Marines counted over 500 Japanese bodies on the ridge alone, 200 piled on Hill 123's slopes. The smell was overwhelming. Bodies were buried in mass graves or burned. Edson's force had suffered heavily. 59 killed, over 200 wounded. Only 86 of the 240 Paramarines emerged unscathed. But they had survived the impossible, repelling wave after wave of Banzai charges. When the final assaults came that morning, the Marines offered fierce resistance despite exhaustion. Japanese companies that breached the lines were isolated and cut down. Kawaguchi, realizing the offensive had failed, ordered a withdrawal. His losses totaled around 830 killed in the assaults, with hundreds more wounded or missing. A devastating blow to his 6,200-man force. Edson and his survivors were relieved over the next days, but their stand had saved Henderson Field. As they were marched to the rear, one Marine turned to another and said, "We held, boys. We held." The aftermath. The victory at Edson's Ridge had ripple effects far beyond Guadalcanal. Kawaguchi's defeat marked the first major land setback for the Imperial Japanese Army in the war. It prevented the recapture of Henderson Field, allowing the Cactus Air Force to maintain air superiority. Japanese reinforcements continued via Tokyo Express runs, but the momentum shifted. By February 1943, the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal, conceding the island after 6 months of brutal fighting. Edson and his men spent the rest of the campaign in further battles, but many were rotated out due to wounds or illness. Of the raiders and paramarines who fought on the ridge, survival was a miracle, a testament to their grit. Kawaguchi was relieved of command, his career tarnished by the failure. For years, the battle was overshadowed by larger engagements like Tarawa or Iwo Jima. Records were spotty, and the chaos of Guadalcanal buried many details. It wasn't until post-war histories that Bloody Ridge's significance emerged. The psychology of defense. The stand at Edson's Ridge reveals deep truths about defensive warfare in the jungle. A determined force in prepared positions can defy overwhelming odds, especially against tactics like Banzai charges. Edson's Marines succeeded by exploiting key advantages. First, terrain. The ridge's open slopes created kill zones for artillery and machine guns. The Japanese had to attack uphill, exposed, while the Marines fired from cover. Second, preparation. Edson repositioned his lines for depth, with interlocking fire and reserves ready. Artillery observers directed precise barrages, turning charges into slaughters. Third, discipline. Amid panic and close-quarters terror, leaders like Edson and Bailey kept men fighting. They didn't break, even when infiltrated. From the Japanese side, it showed the pitfalls of overconfidence. Kawaguchi assumed superior numbers and night attacks would prevail, but jungle disorientation fragmented his force. Banzai charges, effective against lesser foes, withered under concentrated fire. Assumptions cost time and lives. This is the defender's advantage. In strong positions, a smaller force can inflict disproportionate casualties, forcing attackers to hesitate and bleed out. The Forgotten Heroes. In 1943, Merritt Edson received the Medal of Honor for his leadership at Bloody Ridge. Other Marines got Navy Crosses and Silver Stars. But for decades, the battle faded from public memory, eclipsed by Guadalcanal's broader narrative. Why? It happened early in the campaign, amid confusion. Many participants were killed or evacuated soon after. The story didn't fit neat victory tales. It was a desperate hold, not a conquest. Plus, the Pacific War's savagery, with no quarter fighting, made it uncomfortable. Yet Bloody Ridge was a triumph. Edson's mission: hold the ridge, protect the airfield. He did, disrupting Japanese plans and buying time for reinforcements. The lessons endure. Bloody Ridge offers timeless lessons. First, leadership. Edson, at 45, inspired younger men with calm decisiveness. In crisis, he adapted, rallied, and won. Second, small units' power. Doctrine often emphasizes offense, but Guadalcanal showed dug-in defenders with fire support can halt larger forces. Third, fog of war. Kawaguchi's poor intelligence and navigation doomed him. Commanders must verify assumptions. Fourth, cumulative impact. The ridge wasn't Guadalcanal's decider, but one of many stands, Tenaru, Matanikau, that wore down the Japanese. The human cost. Behind the tactics were young men in hell. Most Marines were in their late teens or early 20s, far from home, battling heat, insects, and fear. One raider recalled, "The Banzai screams chilled your blood. They'd come out of nowhere, and you'd fight for your life." A paramarine described the end. Ammo gone, bayonets fixed. It was kill or be killed. But the colonel kept us going. The toll. Frostbite? No. Tropical ulcers, malaria, psychological scars. Pride bonded survivors. They'd faced the abyss and held the final accounting. Bloody Ridge's significance? In World War II's vast scope, a small clash, but pivotal. The 48-hour hold denied Japan air control, grinding their offensive. Delays let Marines reinforce, leading to victory. Historians credit such actions for Guadalcanal's fall. Not one battle, but accumulated attrition. Edson's stand gave hours for planes to fly, supplies to land, defenses to strengthen. The legacy. Today, Guadalcanal is peaceful, with memorials at Bloody Ridge. Veterans' stories like Edson's, who died in 1955, inspire. Reunions echoed. Worse days, but we mattered. 800 Marines shattered 3,000 attackers, changing the Pacific War. They didn't conquer empires. They held a ridge and did their duty. So, what do you think? Was Edson's Ridge one of World War II's most underrated battles? Could the Marines have withdrawn? Or was their stand worth the blood? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more tales of valor from military history.